share with you kind of over this class and really over the next 4 classes is how to actually start to think about yourself as an evidence-based entrepreneur. Part of what my job here to do is actually to help you get over the hump and over the next, really this semester, help you actually by the end of the next 4 weeks have yourself something in your hands that you would consider your startup. So if you follow along with me, do the homework outside of class and kind of follow along, I think that you'll have something in your hands that you can truly say, you can learn, test, and iterate on. But the idea here is to go in this activity and be very action-based. Let me get started here and welcome you all to this, what we're calling the MVP series, Minimum Viable Product. And so that's essentially one of the key traits of startups these days, is how do you wind up developing a minimum viable product? So over the next really semester, what we're going to try and do is help you become an evidence-based entrepreneur. I know some people say this guy's Steve Jobs, he was a visionary, but Steve Jobs even had a process that helped him become great. And so I argue that Steve Jobs is actually an evidence-based entrepreneur. We're going to talk about how you use data, rather than kind of your gut and intuition, but how you actually use data to make our early decisions. And ultimately, by the end of this, I want each of you all to have an MVP in your hands that you can show and use. So follow along, and hopefully this will be a fun, entertaining journey. So how does this process actually work in this class a little bit? So it is going to be very action focused here. So the idea is if you have an idea or you want to start something, follow along and actually start something with me. So it doesn't have to be your best idea, it doesn't have to be the only idea, but part of the trick here is you're going to get so much more by doing. So throughout this I'm actually going to assign some homework, we'll call it, but some things you can do outside of class to prepare for the next class. There's going to be 4 lectures and kind of workshops, but at the same token, there will be things to take with you and do. So we can only cover a little bit in an hour, but there's a lot of things you'll be able to cover out of class. And I'll actually be coming back a couple times on campus to do office hours and answer questions along the way. So this is a little bit like taking a class, sort of, but ultimately it's incumbent on you guys to ultimately put in the work and see what you have out of it. And at the end, the goal is that every one of you will have some type of a minimum viable product. Sound good? Okay. So let me talk about what the series is a little bit, and I'll talk as I go into this a little bit. We're going to start by dispelling some of the myths about what is kind of lean entrepreneurship, what it means to be a startup and the like. Today, we're going to talk about what is a lean entrepreneur and applying the key principles of this lean movement you've heard about. Has everyone heard of kind of lean as a principle, lean startup? All right, so it's actually a word that's become fairly bastardized these days, so we're actually going to kind of tell you where it came from and what it means. The next lecture, we're actually going to talk a little bit about creating a minimum viable company. We're going to use some of the scientific processes and methods to do things like, how do you pick the name of your company? Is it some kind of great name that inspiration strikes at night? I'm going to argue that there's a much more of a way to do it that's a little easier, simpler, and it doesn't have to be super creative. The third and the fourth lecture, we're going to talk at the start about building an actual MVP, and last one I'm going to bring some friends in who actually will help sit down with all of you and kind of help you build your own MVPs. So over the course of the semester, we're going to have a chance to meet at least 4 times outside of class. So as you have questions, there'll be office hours to talk about things, but ultimately these are the 4 key lectures. We're going to be recording all of them, so to the extent that folks can't make it, feel free, we'll have the videos posted online, and we'll use this as a way to kind of go along the fly. So, my name's Eric Custer, and as Jeff said, I'm an entrepreneur by training. So that's some of the stuff that I've done at the bottom, but ultimately I will start with this, is I've actually seen the light. In some of my last companies, I was a gut-driven entrepreneur, and I did the things that I thought everyone should do. I thought you had to have inspiration and great ideas and hustle and all those type of things, and I realized over the last couple of years that there's actually a process. And I've had the opportunity to work with some of the big thinkers in this movement, including Steve Blank from Columbia and Stanford, Jerry Engel, the dean at Berkeley, and others, Eric Ries included. So I'm actually going to share a lot of ideas that may not necessarily be mine, but that I'm going to assemble a lot of the things here that will give you all the tools to become a lean-based entrepreneur and someone who's essentially using evidence to drive their startup decisions as opposed to gut and feel. So I'm going to be your Sherpa, I'll take you along, and I promise some of the things may feel like, why is he having us do this? What's the point of this? I promise there's a purpose in it, and ultimately the goal, again, is to get you an MVP by the end of this process. So let's get going. So I'm going to talk today, and this is the first lecture that we're going to go through. The first thing we're going to talk about is this history of lean, and many of you have heard of this thing called the lean startup. The truth is, lean startup simply stole the concept of lean from many, many people who've been there long before. So we'll talk about where it came from and kind of what it's evolved into. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the key tools that I actually see being used in this kind of creating your own lean company and evidence-based entrepreneurship. And then over the course of the next 4 classes, we're going to talk about 6 tools In each class, we're going to talk about a couple of them, but these tools are really the key tools that you'll have in your tool belt as an evidence-based entrepreneur. So two of them we're going to talk about today is actually a systematic approach for idea generation. So who here has an idea? Would you raise your hand? Already has an idea? All right, who here doesn't have an idea? Raise your hand. All right, so that's great. So this is actually perfect. So some of you will actually have an idea, and we're going to go through some exercises on how you take that idea and actually make sure it's the right idea. And for those of you who don't have an idea, we're going to actually do the same thing, where we're going to kind of have you talk about things that you're inspired by and ultimately come up with an idea to start working on. So that's the first step, is actually idea generation. Not everyone is this great visionary who comes up with things, but you can ultimately find good ideas to work on. The second step in this process is actually called customer discovery, and so that's really been pioneered by Steve Blank, and we'll talk about the process. And today I'm going to kind of give you guys some homework to actually go out and start talking to prospective customers and give you all the tools to do that. Let me start with this concept of how we actually got here. So the reality is the word lean has been around for a long time, and it actually has been taken by other industries and applied. So who here is a 30 Rock fan? Great. Have you guys ever seen Jack Donahue talk about Six Sigma? So that actually, Six Sigma is one of the things that actually has been brought into the lean startup movement. So lean as a concept, lean manufacturing actually began with Toyota long ago, where they figured out ways to actually optimize the manufacturing process, and that's been applied to business. So now you're seeing a lot of things spread throughout corporate America, and fortunately, over the last really dozen years or so, you've started to see some of those principles flow into startups, and particularly software startups. But things like Six Sigma and total quality management have kind of emerged as really things that are helping us understand what is this lean thinking. So we're not reinventing the wheel with the lean startup movement, we're actually just taking principles that have worked and applying it to the early stage of a startup. So the second part of this question is, you've seen what lean is, so what is a startup? So a lot of times what people would say is, when they thought of the word startup, they thought it was a place in Silicon Valley that had ping pong tables, they let you take your dog to work, and oftentimes they would just spend a lot of money. But the reality is there's actually becoming an understood concept of what a startup is. So a startup isn't just a smaller version of a big company. That's actually not at all what it is. So for a long time, pardon the academic reference here, Jeff, for a long time, entrepreneurship just took the concept of big companies and smushed them down to small elements of that for startups. But the reality is, what we've learned is that startups are actually temporary organizations. So if you're great at starting your company, you will only be a startup for so long, and you'll graduate into a company that's growing. So the startup process is actually a temporary organization that's designed to search for something. And what you're searching for is a business model. In simplest terms here, it's a way to do something that people pay you for. So a product or service that you're going to do that someone's going to pay you for. That's a business model. So McDonald's has a business model. ExxonMobil has a business model. All of these business models, some of them are very well known, like a restaurant is a business model that's well understood. Some of them, like Facebook, was a brand new business model that came about. So ultimately what startups are doing is they're actually searching for business models that happen to be repeatable and scalable. So startups, again, just to be clear, startups are not small versions of companies. They're actually temporary organizations that are in the search mode. So what we're going to be spending time over the next 4 months or so is really thinking about how we more effectively search. And that's really what the core is behind this lean movement. It's actually making the search process more efficient. So again, startups are not just small companies. They're actually organizations that are temporary and designed to grow into a scalable business. So as a result of taking those two concepts, the lean movement, which is thinking about ways to be more efficient and kind of drive process, and startups, you've actually seen that there's been tools that are now in place to start to take this concept of the art of a small business or a startup and turn it into science. And there's really been three big, I would say, leaders in this thought process. One in the center is Steve Blank, who's actually a multi-time entrepreneur who writes about the concept of actually using customer discovery to figure out what you should build. And that was a really big revolution in startups. A lot of times it was you trusted your gut and you said, like, I've got a great idea. And now Steve has pioneered this idea to say, let's actually stop trusting our gut and let's listen to what customers say. So that's one of the tools that we're going to talk about, is customer discovery. The other one is the Business Model Canvas by Alexander Osterwalder. And so essentially what Alexander has done is put together a framework where on one page you can start to understand how your business model works. The third one is Eric Ries, who's actually a disciple in some ways of Steve Blank and took Steve's class. essentially combine some of these elements to use the scientific process and testing to make decisions. So these were three of the first individuals who really over the last 10-ish years or so started to consolidate a lot of the thinking about entrepreneurship to this concept of taking the lean principles and startups and combining them together. And so what's happened really over the last 2 to 3 years is we've seen an explosion around lean. And now it's everywhere. And I think you can all agree with me that suddenly this concept of lean startup goes on the front page of the Harvard Business Review. You know that it's gone mainstream, kind of in business thinking. So what I'm here to talk about a little bit is, since it's gone mainstream, let's actually understand what's going on rather than just saying like, I'm lean or I understand the lean startup principles, how it actually works. One of the things that's important to know is entrepreneurship, it's not magic. And I know that people will oftentimes like to look at guys like Mark Zuckerberg, Larry Ellison, and others and say they had great ideas. But the reality is that it's a process that they went through, and many of them may not have known that they were doing it. So what we're going to talk about is evidence-based entrepreneurship. And it's really somewhat revolutionary in startup thinking for really over the last couple of years even. And it's something that we're now starting to be taught at universities and also in startup communities around the world. So what does evidence-based really mean, and why does it matter? So ultimately, the thought process is, can we, or can the entrepreneur, design a process that uses data, uses evidence and facts to help you along the process in your search for the scalable, repeatable business model? So it's really essentially more of a framework than it is some kind of magic. And what we're trying to do is give you the tools and the framework to help you make that search process more effective. At the end of the day, you're searching for something. You don't know the answer, we don't necessarily know what it's going to become, but if you have the tools and the process, it makes it much less chaotic and much more systematic. So that's what we're going to be doing here, is actually trying to understand what evidence-based entrepreneurship is together. And the realities of this process is that data is now starting to show that it actually works. And this is one of the, you can trust me to say that it works, having done several startups both with and without this system, but the reality is that actually data is showing that it works. So the National Science Foundation has begun to put forth studies where they actually took some students who have National Science Foundation grants, and some of them they just let them go through the normal process of starting the company without any structure. Others of them, they put them through a formal program called the Lean Launchpad, which uses a lot of the concepts we're going to talk about here. And the results are pretty staggering. 300% more companies actually got funded as a result of going through this process than without. So again, I'm not proclaiming that this is magic in and of itself, but it's a process. And the results speak for themselves, is that in taking real entrepreneurs who are interested in starting their company, and those giving them a process and those without a process, you see 60% of the entrepreneurs got funding who actually went through the process, whereas only 18% on average would get funding without it. So there's really 6 tools that I find are important to have in a lean entrepreneur's tool belt. And they're going to map them to these 4 courses that we're going to talk about. And so in each one of them, we're going to talk about some of the tools and the tactics. And then I'm going to give each of you guys some homework to actually get better at using some of these tools over time. So again, I recommend each of you to actually do this for real. Like, we can happily talk about this as a lecture, but it's much better if we're action-based here and you're actually applying this to a concept. It may not be the best home run idea you have, but the more and more you try it, the better you're going to get at it. So today we're going to talk about 2 of them: idea generation and customer discovery. For the next class, we're going to talk about data-driven decision-making. And this is how we're going to actually show to use data rather than our guts and our creative minds to pick the name of our company, pick logos, and the like. We're also going to talk about how to use the crowd that can be really helpful in a way to understand and get more information about your startup. 5th and the 6th points here are really understanding how to create and use minimum viable products in your actual startup process. And finally, we're going to talk about using all of these tools in the actual act of customer development. So by the end of this course and going through these lectures, we're hoping that each of you will have these 6 tools in your tool belt and be able to use them. Now, again, this only works if you use the tools, and so part of this is ultimately you have to trust a little bit. It's a little bit more work sometimes to use these tools. It's great to go online and hunt for domain names and be like, oh, this is a great domain name. But the reality is that there's actually a process here where you can go rather than hunting and using your gut to pick the right thing. So that's what we're going to talk about. These are the tools that we're going to do, and by the end of it, each of you should have some experience in using each of these tools in your own startup journey.